but we couldn't have a better group of panelists to help us think it through and consider strategies for how to address the question and the problem. So first, we're joined by Miriam Pemberton. She's an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and author most recently of 6 Stops on the National Security Tour, Rethinking Warfare Economies. It's just out from Routledge Press. I highly recommend it, and I'll send a link to it out briefly in a few moments. We'll also hear from Heidi Peltier, a senior researcher at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs and the director of programs at the Cost of War Project. She's written extensively on the economics of Pentagon spending and public investments. She's the author of Creating a Clean Energy Economy, How Investments in Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Can Create Jobs in a Sustainable Economy. And rounding out the panel is Emma Claire Foley. She's an associate partner for policy and research at Global Zero, author of a new report, The Real Cost of Icbm's U.S. Economic Development Beyond Defense Spending. So before we jump in, I want to say a few words about the Quincy Institute. We're an action-oriented think tank devoted to promoting a U.S. foreign policy that moves away from endless war and towards vigorous diplomacy to promote international peace. You can find out more about our programs and positions at quincyinst.org. That's quincyinst.org. You can see our publications, get on our mailing list, sign up for future events. We'd also like you to take a look at Responsible Statecraft, our online magazine at responsiblestatecraft.org. It has a wide range of articles, essays on foreign policy issues, and is well worth consulting on a regular basis. So let's jump in. As you probably know, for the second year running, Congress is poised to add tens of billions of dollars to the Pentagon budget beyond what the department even asked for. And they're adding on top of a huge sum. The Biden proposal was more than $100 billion more than peak spending during the Cold War. So no small sum. And the push to spend ever more on the Pentagon is closely tied to the economics of Pentagon spending, to jobs created in states and congressional districts of members who then vote for these kinds of increases. So our question today is, what can we do to reduce that dependency, open the way to ideally lower Pentagon spending and a more balanced approach to security, both for America and the world? So let me start with some questions for the panel. First, for Miriam, your book looked at how communities around the country have grappled with this issue of defense dependency. What were your major findings in terms of what's needed to approach this issue, both from the local and the national level?
Yeah. So first, on the core question of whether military contractors can in fact redirect their production lines to other demilitarized purposes, Lockheed Martin's former CEO, Norman Augustine, once said that conversion has a record unblemished by success. And this is simply not true. A chapter in my book is focused on a major prime contractor who figured out how to take what they knew about the hydraulic systems they were working on for the F-16 and pioneer really a new design for a hybrid electric bus that is now reducing emissions literally all over the world. However, I've been for years looking for these examples, and it's very hard to find them. They are marginalized, and they're going to stay marginalized. They are not going to be, a major component of a demilitarized economy unless two conditions are met. And one is obviously to cut the military budget, and the other is to develop a new industrial policy to take the place of the one militarized industrial policy that we currently have. And it seems clear to me that this new industrial policy needs to be focusing on what I hope will soon all be and will be officially named the climate emergency. So the closest thing we have to a test case for these two conditions, would they really work, was the post-Cold War period. Military spending was cut by a third and procurement spending by 2/3. And when Bill Clinton gave his victory speech, he talked about how he was going to convert a military giant of the United States to a domestic giant. This didn't entirely happen. We can talk about the reasons why military spending rebounded. But there was this conversion program, and it was had quite a lot of interesting components, including worker retraining and community transition planning, some loan guarantees for small and medium-sized manufacturers to convert their operations to civilian purposes. It had a program called the Technology Reinvestment Project that was quite interesting. It gave grants to consortiums involving a defense manufacturer and a commercial manufacturer, and an array of other possible entities like the national labs, academic institutions, and so on. And they had some successes. The defect of that program was, and more broadly, the Clintonian kind of have your cake and eat it too approach to things was that we found that 85% of those projects had to be dual use, which is to say they had to serve both military and commercial markets, and straddling those two purposes really did, hamstring the possibilities of really grabbing hold of what was possible in the civilian economy. The real problem with the Clinton conversion program was that most of the savings went into deficit reduction, about 85%, rather than being targeted to investments that might pull manufacturers into the civilian sector. So I feel like we know what we have to do. And although the Supreme Court and Joe Manchin are going to have made this harder, it seems like, maybe the tightening vice of climate change effects right here and now that everyone is feeling viscerally every day may finally push us where we need to go.
Thanks, Miriam. And I think it's important, as you said, to look past this particular moment, which is particularly challenging because I think the problems are so deep and so enduring that we're going to have an opening for new policies. It's just ideally the sooner the better, but that's going to be a battle that'll be going on, from now forward. Heidi, your research has shown that almost any other form of spending will create more jobs than Pentagon spending. So why is that exactly? And what does it mean for a possible transition away from a militarized economy?
Thanks, Bill, and thank you to everybody who's participating. Thanks, Miriam, for your book. I look forward to reading it in a detailed way, and thanks, Quincy, for organizing the panel. This question about job creation through military spending is something I've been working on for quite a few years. And initially, we were interested in addressing the notion that we need defense spending for jobs. This has been around for decades, this idea that we can't cut military spending because there's going to be a negative effect on employment, there's going to be a negative effect on the economy. And so starting 15 years ago or so, I started working on this research, looking at how many jobs do we actually get for a given amount of spending in the military, and how many jobs would we get if we spent the money elsewhere. Specifically, how many would we get in clean energy or infrastructure or education or healthcare, other areas that are domestic priorities and that lead to other types of security. And what we found, time after time, even though in each iteration the numbers change slightly, the relative magnitudes are always the same, that military spending does not create as many jobs as the other areas. That if we take, for example, $1 million of spending, that creates about 7 jobs through the military. That same million spent in clean energy or infrastructure would create about 10 jobs, so about 40% more jobs for the same amount of spending. And if we put that instead in healthcare or education, we create twice as many jobs. And the main reason for that is that those sectors are more labor intensive. So if we look at each million of spending, more of that money in healthcare and education is going to pay for salaries and wages. Whereas in the military, more of the spending is going to pay for plants and equipment. And then another reason for the increase in jobs in sectors like healthcare and education is more of those jobs are local, more of the spending stays in the local economy. And less of it is spent overseas. So there's more domestic job creation. For clean energy, whether it's greater job creation domestically or not depends on how much domestic manufacturing there is. So there will be installation and maintenance work that is local, but how much of the manufacturing jobs are created depends on whether we're importing or producing those goods ourselves in the US. So one of the implications is, as we're thinking about defense conversion and shifting funds, as Miriam mentioned, in the Clinton administration, rather than shifting funding from defense into other industries, the savings were used to pay down the deficit. If we instead decrease defense spending and increase or shift it over into healthcare or education or clean energy, we would get a gain in employment because any shift would increase jobs. If we use some of that to fund things specifically like clean energy manufacturing facilities, then we can increase the domestic job creation for the clean energy industry. And we can think about what are the types of jobs that would be lost in the defense industry and what types of similar jobs could be replaced in something like clean energy or infrastructure, and really target investments in the areas that would be most likely hit by job losses as we reduce defense spending and increase in those same geographical areas in other industries that are important for other types of security.
Thanks. And I should tell folks, Heidi's writings on this can be found in a number of places, but in particular, she's written some good papers and issue briefs on the Brown Costs of War website on green manufacturing, the opportunity costs, job opportunity costs of war, on the commercialization of military operations. So that's a good place to look if you want additional information on this. Now, Emma Claire, you just completed a study that looks at the role of ICBM bases in local communities and how that relationship spurs lobbying to keep the bases. And of course, if you keep the bases, you keep the ICBMs in the arsenal, regardless of whether we need them, regardless of what dangers they may cause because of the unique nature of those weapon systems. So what are the challenges involved in reducing the role of these bases in local economies?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Miriam and Heidi, for your remarks as well. Sorry, it's very loud where I am. But basically, my work on the ICBM bases really focuses on the how of conversion and the way we can approach one major case of the very many that exist in the U.S. Where, of one, understanding how defense spending works in a local and state economy, and two, the unique challenges that presents for a transition to something more sustainable and better for communities. But I think the base closure issue is one that comes up in very many of these examples, obviously because this is how the military maintains weapon systems, everything that we're relying on for job creation, as we've spoken about already. But I think we've seen in the past few years that the discussion around base closure has really narrowed. There was a specific provision, I believe, in the 2015 NDAA preventing further rounds of what's called base realignment and closure, or BRAC, which was the process established in the late 80s to determine which bases might need to be closed and how to do that. But all that is to say, it's not impossible at all. We have abundant examples covered a little bit in my report, as well as in Heidi Miriam's work and Bill yours as well, of how this can be done well. And I think that, the one main takeaway from all of that would be community participation, right? The more people who have more of a stake in these communities that rely on defense spending, in the process of moving towards something else, the better. The other major thing I would say, the major finding, is that we need more real material support for these communities as they transition to a new economic mix. If you look at communities that have undergone this transition a few decades out, generally you'll see that a lot of them are doing better economically than they were before, although at that time depth, it's hard to piece apart what exactly is the core cause of that. But one of the main things that I've found from looking at a lot of these cases is that, making sure that these communities are supported from the beginning during that process of transition is going to be really key for making this a workable option. But one more note, though, is that, there's been this really concerted attempt to make this seem impossible. There was a shift even in naming the office within the Pentagon that oversees these transitions from the Office of Economic Adjustment, sort of a boring but name that implies that this can actually be done and is a routine part of maintaining U.S. defense presence, to the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation. And what that does, I think, in a sort of underhanded way, is really shift the risk inherent in relying on defense spending to the communities that supposedly benefit from it, right? I think, adjusting and reducing defense spending is a totally normal process in an overall approach to budgeting. But, there's a responsibility to make sure that, the people who are going to work every day, who are supposedly receiving some benefit from the spending, are not the ones, left holding the bag when defense needs change.
Thanks a lot. So we'll do another round of questions and then open it to Q&A from the audience. I know some people are already putting questions there. If you have a question, just go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, click and put in the question. I'm sure we won't get to all of them, but we'll try to get to a representative sample. So on this round, Miriam, what would you say was the most surprising thing you learned in researching your book?
Yeah, so I discovered in stop after stop on my tour that there were these communities that were flooded with military money, but also at the same time remained mired in economic distress. So for example, I went to Los Alamos, which is, Los Alamos County is routinely mentioned on the list of Forbes magazine's top per capita income locations. The county right next to Los Alamos County, at the bottom of the mesa where it is Rio Arriba County, which is routinely listed on the list of 10 most economically distressed counties in the United States. Then there was an air base north of Los Angeles, where 3 of the prime contractors, Lockheed, Northrop, and Boeing, all do defense production right there on the base. So I interviewed the economic development director of the adjacent town, which was Palmdale, California, and he ruefully referred to the reputation of his city as a basket case. So, and example after example came up in this tour of mine. So this is all anecdotal. So I decided to look at the top 20 most defense-dependent states and the 3 counties within those states that were themselves most defense-dependent. So a sample of 60 of the most defense-dependent counties in the United States. And then I looked at their poverty rates. And in nearly half of the cases, the poverty rate in those counties where the most military money is going was the poverty rate was above the national average. So, of course, dumping millions into communities will create a lot of jobs. As Heidi has shown repeatedly, and not as many as other forms of, other kinds of job creation. But I like to refer to the prosperity gospel of military spending. And contrary to that gospel that you put military spending in there and you're going to create community prosperity. I think this analysis shows that it's really not true that Pentagon dependency is a reliable ticket to community prosperity for the community as a whole.
Wow, that's a great, interesting finding. I think, that it suggests that perhaps running after military contracts could actually create impediments to broader prosperity and security for communities, which is very much contrary to the PR of the industry, the Pentagon, their allies in Congress. So I think, something to kind of an argument to bring to bear when we talk about reducing dependency. So Emma Claire, in your report, you have a case study of Montana and Malmstrom Air Force Base, which is an ICBM base. What were your findings on the challenges and opportunities in that specific case?
Thanks. So I think that Montana is a really fascinating case for this as the first ICBM base, and one like the others that's had this mission for many decades. And the cities that support these bases, and Great Falls, where Malmstrom Air Force Base is located, really grew up around the base. So while the effort to maintain support for and the existence of the ICBM mission as it's currently constituted, and the GBSD, the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Replacement Program, is an active political project that's ongoing at all levels. It's still, it's something that's been there for a long time and has a kind of, has roots, so to speak, these silos, located in all these fields around the city. But I would say for Montana, again, all of these cases, there are many urgent needs that could be addressed by redirecting funding or by increasing funding in anticipation of a reduction of the ICBM mission, for example. That would result in more job creation than what's been promised in connection with the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program. A few cases that I highlight in the report are the housing crisis, which, as I'm sure we all have heard, is gripping the entire country, but it's hit Montana especially hard. When I was out there doing interviews with folks, there was a real sense that the pandemic had exacerbated it and had brought high earners in from other states to purchase land and kind of drive up the price of homes. It seems like this is definitely true to some extent, but the fact is, the pressures that are creating this crisis across the country are somewhat greater there, and it's a real opportunity to invest in a sector which can create jobs and can really address a true human security need. A couple other aspects of the issue that I highlighted there were climate change. Of course, the two biggest industries in the state are agriculture and tourism, both of which have been hit really hard by the climate crisis. You saw about 1 million acres of the state go up in smoke during the fire season, which increasingly is all year last year. And the fishing industry, which is a big part of tourism there, has been hit hard. There are many other examples, but these are kind of two that were constantly brought up to me, and I think are on the top of people's minds there. The third example I'll mention is healthcare, and as we've discussed already, this is a much more powerful job creator than defense, certainly. And what's interesting to me is that there has been some shift at the local level in Great Falls towards healthcare as a basis for the local economy, in a way that's really tied to a sense of the potential instability of defense funding, even in a situation where so much has been done to make it seem eternal, inevitable, like something that can just go on forever. And what we've seen is that in a rural state, one of the most rural states in the country, where healthcare demand is going up, especially in rural areas, especially for older citizens. An effort to attract investment and new healthcare facilities in the Great Falls area has been successful, and has led to a establishment of the city as kind of a hub for healthcare in that region of the state. So I think there's plenty of examples within Montana, and I could talk about this for hours, of how there's already been action at the local level to address this, about what kind of opportunities there really are to adjust the way we do defense spending, we do spending in general at the state level, to really allow Americans to just live better and more prosperous and stable lives. But yeah, I'd love to take questions about that as well.
Great. Yeah, I think there's, as you said, there's a lot more to be said on that. And I'd be game to go for hours, but some other folks may want to stop at the agreed upon time. So before we go to Q&A, I just wanted the panelists, to react to anything somebody else has said, or if there's some key point that you wish you had gotten into your answers to the questions. All right, you're supposed to. Oh yeah, go ahead. Miriam. Miriam, go ahead.
Okay, so I was just reading about this possibility that Biden may declare a climate emergency, which would be really excellent. And I read that a few Democratic senators have suggested that he redirect spending on military bases to build renewable energy and finance distributed energy projects on the bases. And Emma, in your report, you talked about this program, I don't know if it's an acronym, that USACE, which sounded similar. And I wonder if that's what they're referring to, and what you see as the possibilities for that.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about this question is that it kind of creates so many other questions. And one of the big ones was base conversion, of course, but another one was reform of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is what I'm talking about there. And I think there's a really complex history there, where this organization that has done so much to create the infrastructure of the United States today has also been a target of bipartisan reform efforts, rightly so, been sort of understood as having kind of a mixed legacy. And so I think part of the recommendations in the report, and I think part of the full comprehensive approach to this issue, is making sure that if we're proposing, as I think I've certainly seen happen over the past few years, as is one possible approach to the really urgent task of mitigating climate change, especially, but also infrastructure renewal and all these interrelated tasks. If we're thinking about the military as a tool for that, I think this is like one key element of that potential approach that we should be taking a really hard look at. So I tried to cover that. I tried to cover the role of the Army Corps of Engineers a little bit in the report, but there's a lot more to be said there, obviously.
And Heidi, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I have two things. One is I wanted to add on a little bit to what I was talking about earlier, and then I also asked Miriam a question. So first is, I think it's useful for us to think about the concept of just transition as we're talking about military conversion. So when I was at the Political Economy Research Institute, Perry at UMass, I contributed to a number of reports looking at the transition from a fossil fuel economy to a clean energy economy and what would happen with job losses in the fossil fuel sector. Because it's not fair or ethical of us to ask fossil fuel workers to bear the burden of this shift. And I think the same thing is true in thinking about military conversion, that there will be, even if the net job change is an increase, even if we create more jobs than are lost, there will be job losses for specific individuals and in specific communities. And I can talk more about the details, but if anybody's interested. But essentially, we found that there is a need for both individual level supports as well as community level supports. So individual supports can take the form of retraining or relocation, early retirement in some cases, and also wage subsidies. I was reading through the Q&A a little bit and saw one question about the disparity in the wages between highly paid defense workers, or in that case highly paid fossil fuel workers, and the potentially lower paid industries they'd move into. So one of the supports that we advocated for was a wage subsidy, essentially to supplement the change for a given number of years until the industry kind of picks up. So I just wanted to mention that idea of a just transition as we think about military conversion. And then I wanted to ask Miriam, in the 90s, when there were not very many successful examples of conversion, and when the funding that we expected to be, it was called then the peace dividend, didn't materialize, what do we learn from that? What do we take away from that so that the same thing doesn't happen now? And we see after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the defense budget hasn't gone down, it's gone up, and it's projected to go up for the next 5 years. And so how do we change that, and what did you learn in researching your book that might help set us up toward thinking that way?
Well, I think the Quincy Institute has done a great job of looking at the arguments for higher defense spending that were, some of them were used back then. For the most part, it was defense hawks saying, oh, we need to build multiple layers of military dominance to avoid, the reemergence of a peer competitor to our status as the sole superpower. And that argument, the contractors pushed that argument, and defense wonks, and the military, and so it became a way of avoiding doing the kinds of transitions that that we needed to make at that time. Another surprising thing I learned, I didn't know, was that the chair of Lockheed Martin in 1992 said, we think that our growth is going to come in the next years from the civilian sector, and that in a few years we'd be 55% in civilian manufacturing and 45% in military manufacturing, and whether he meant it or not, he found ways to avoid that fate. Although this technology reinvestment project I talked about did fund Lockheed to work with this bus manufacturer to produce these hybrid electric buses. And just as that market was beginning to take off, Lockheed pulled out and sold this facility to BAE Systems, which then pursued it. And as I say, there are buses, these hybrid buses that they pioneered in the streets of New York and London and Tokyo and now Houston and Philadelphia. They're all over. However, this is now, because of these two conditions that I mentioned, ramped up military spending and the lack of a strong alternative industrial policy. So this bus project, which is employing 350 people doing useful work, and they're expanding their business, but it remains only 5% of what happens at that facility. So again, if military spending were cut in the same ways that it was back in the Cold War, post-Cold War period, BAE would move, that ship would move, but at the moment it's the second most defense-dependent company in the world. And so with these buses, it's a differential of investment dollars. So instead of having this one dedicated customer of the Pentagon, to make this project go, they had to cobble together funding, from the federal, little bits from the Federal Transportation Authority, and from this California is one of the most, has I think the best model for a green industrial policy. So they got a little money from this California project and, various other little pots of money, but they asked their lobbyists, could you go to the Department of Transportation and, do some lobbying on behalf of, the money we need to really ramp this production up. And the lobbyists said, we don't even know where the Department of Transportation is. We know how to market to the Pentagon. We'll do this. We'll go there. But this is not really our day job as we know it. So, here are some of the reasons why, to prevent what happened in the post-Cold War period from happening again, we're going to need to cut the budget, keep it cut, and as you said, reinvest on the civilian side of the government, of the economy, to create, what economists like Heidi call demand pull, to move these companies and give them, enough to really go on in the civilian sector.
Great. And just one more thing before we go to the Q&A. Emma Claire, one of the interesting things in your report was talking about these estimates of jobs and local economic impacts not really having a sound basis. Could you talk about that just briefly?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that I spent a long time doing was reading local and state government, as well as estimates produced by the Department of Defense for the economic impact of the Icbm program and the base presence in these cities generally. And these numbers were totally mystifying at first glance, because there, of course, there's no spreadsheet that they come with. There's no citation or accounting generally for what what goes into calculating these numbers. But after puzzling over them for a long time, after speaking to people at the state legislatures, at independent organizations within the states, and also getting an assist from Tricia White, who's at FAS at the time, who had done a little bit of work on this herself, I came to realize that all of the estimates I was seeing were drawn from, I believe, a single GAO report from the mid-90s, produced as part of the base realignment and closure process happening then. And they were not at all, what the report did essentially was produce what's called a multiplier. So it sort of takes what a dollar of investment and multiplies it by this number, which tries to estimate the total impact that will occur through an economies, if this money is spent. But the multipliers were calculated as part of an attempt to estimate what would happen like in a totally different economic situation. I don't think I need to explain how much the US economy has changed in the past 30 years. And we're not tailored for specific, situations, specific locations. So the main work I was doing in connection with this research is for a transparent, publicly funded study, which includes stakeholders from the cities and states that are most affected by this defense spending, to understand the actual economic impact of spending, because this is tremendously impactful. It's a political tool to when Northrop Grumman is giving us estimates of how many jobs will be created, for example, when anyone at any level is trying to justify the status quo or the extreme increase in defense spending we're seeing now. So if we're talking about real benefit to communities, and a real choice, or they're really taking part in a choice for what would work best for them. Being armed with actual information would be a great first step.
Thanks. So we have 20 questions and 17 minutes. So we'll have to do something about the time-space continuum. And I'll try to consolidate some of them. They're detailed, well-informed questions, so it'll be hard to get to all of them. But one point that was made was that we need investments in health and climate in any case. It's difficult for a defense worker to, at least initially, get excited about jobs being created in different industries from where they work. And of course, the politics at the moment are not trending our way. And when Biden was pushing Build Back Better, he was also increasing depending on budget. Now, Build Back Better was mired in the sort of halls of the Senate for reasons that people probably have heard about. And then sort of as a tail to that, there was a time when there was conversion legislation. Walter Reuther, the UAW in the 60s and 70s, Ted Weiss, who used to represent my district in New York, had a bill about it. William Wimpesinger, the machinist in the 80s, was an advocate of conversion planning. Are there any inklings of something like that now, either legislation or interest among members of exploring it? So that's kind of a multi-part question, but one is kind of how do you make that transition from defense workers to investments in other areas? What are our prospects for getting that? And is there interest in conversion in Congress, even if it's kind of nascent?
I could start just by, and I think Heidi knows way more about this than I do, but in Connecticut, one of the most defense dependent states, one of my great sources was the head of the machinists union there, a great guy who read an article by Bill McKibben on the climate crisis about 10 years ago, and sort of, he said, got religion on the subject of climate change. And so he's been on every board in the state of Connecticut trying to push his union, and he's introduced resolutions. His great success in life, he said, was when this one resolution that was opposed by the entire machinists leadership, he made his case and talked about his grandkids who and everybody else's grandkids who needed to grow up in a world that was not decimated by climate change. So he's been working really hard, and he said his former workers making engines for the F-35 out of East Hartford, they would be fine if today they're making F-35 engines and tomorrow they're making wind turbines. They wouldn't mind as long as they got to keep their jobs and keep their same standard of living. So, that's the challenge that we have. To me, the most promising thing on the horizon, well, I was just reading about it this morning, so it suddenly seems like my great hope is what may come out of this declaration of a climate emergency, which may focus more on what can be done through the Defense Production Act to redirect military producers to produce what we need to avoid climate catastrophe. I know there are all sorts of problems with making that work, but it does seem like a great opportunity for all of us and for the country to make a stronger linkage between, this is not just both and, pull up military production and invest in the domestic economy. This is really more like an either or. Let's take defense producers that are producing things that we don't need and get them to produce what we urgently do need. I mean, there's other pieces of legislation. Maxine Waters introduces a conversion bill every year. It's a perfectly fine bill, and then it goes nowhere. So I don't know if others have other thoughts on that.
I'll just mention, go ahead, Bill, you were muted though.
No, go ahead, Heidi.
Thanks. I don't have anything to offer on the legislative side, but I'll mention that when we were working on those reports looking at just transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, labor unions recognized that it was in their best interest to be involved in that process, in crafting clean energy legislation, in trying to protect the jobs of, in the case of United Steelworkers, we were looking at refineries in Washington State, and if how that would affect the steelworkers, and they realized there's room for job growth in the clean energy industry, and that's a way to protect their own base and their own laborers. So I think getting labor unions on board for a military conversion is equally important. Potentially more difficult because in the case of fossil fuels, there's a stronger pull to reduce fossil fuel use and increase clean energy use. There isn't as strong of a pull to reduce military spending. And I think that's one of the big challenges we're facing right now. There's a progressive caucus in Congress that has a number of members that do want to reduce military spending, but there is still this cultural bias toward increased and high military spending. And I think that's, while there are funds that could be shifted into clean energy, I think culturally there's more work to do there.
I would add, even in this difficult moment in terms of reducing Pentagon spending, there is a core within the Congress that realizes that we've gone too far. So there was a vote in the House on the National Defense Authorization Act to roll back that proposed $37 billion increase to what Biden had asked for. And it got 151 votes, including a majority of the Democratic caucus in the House and 14 Republicans, up from one in a similar vote the year before. So that's not a majority, but it shows some movement, and that it's not everybody is on board in Congress with this idea of endless increases. Now there's a question, short enough I can read it, which is not the reason I picked it, but it's great. It says, since the military acknowledges that climate change is a threat to national security, could funding for clean energy come directly from the military budget?
I'll say one quick thing about that and leave it to others after. Yeah, yes and no. I mean, yes, the funding is there and it could come from the military budget, but it's also a justification used to keep military funding high so that, the Pentagon is a huge emitter, and there is a lot for them to do to reduce their own energy use and reduce their own emissions. And that does require funding. But this idea of using funding for mitigating against climate change, I think can cut both ways. I think it can, there's an argument to be made to use military funding for outside of the military to combat climate change, but the military can also use that to maintain its own funding.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I explored this a little bit in my report as kind of like a middle road where maybe we could see military missions shift substantially towards climate change mitigation because the military has the logistical prowess. In earlier moments of public works expansion, in the New Deal era, the military provided things like warehouses full of shovels, for example, or planes that could carry paychecks for workers who were employed in public works projects. So it's definitely happened before, and you can find many other examples from elsewhere in the world. But I would say that it would be a change, nearly as radical as the one we're envisioning for vastly increasing civilian sectors funding for climate change mitigation. But one of the range of possible options, you could look at if you're really trying to think about how to rapidly address climate change.
And Miriam, do you have anything to add? I know you addressed it in your book, but
I think
okay.
It's been...
So another question was reference some of the journalism that Taylor Barnes has done. I know some of us know her work about efforts at conversion, things like in Huntsville, some engineers trying to start a clean energy startup, but communities that have actually resisted military plants moving into their communities, past examples of cases where conversion efforts have worked. So Miriam, when you looked pretty extensively at this, but are there some promising current examples that might be sustained given more support from the federal and state and local levels?
Well, I guess I've been hearing about a new network called the War Industry Resistors Network, and it's focused. It tries to organize individuals in communities that are, have a lot of military production, and kind of do a variety of different strategies, including, let's really dig into what this military economy is, and let's use that research to hold public forums. And I think if they could, add a component that really looks at what federal resources are available to them to look at community transition planning. Emma mentioned this, this transformation of the Office of Economic Adjustment, looking at communities that are defense dependent and have experienced either a base closure or a major contract cancellation. They've been given funds to do that kind of process to come up with an alternative economic base. And as she mentioned, that's now become local defense cooperation. So holding these communities tied to the Pentagon. But in the Obama years, they really did try to ramp up the funding for those community transition planning processes, with, I would say, mixed results that I look at in the book. But I think if well, the problem is that we're not having very many contract cancellations. We're having booming contracts now, and so again, once the contract cancellations come, then there's going to be a lot more interest in communities to look at the possibilities of transition. And I think in terms of federal funding, one avenue that is interesting to me is the Economic Development Administration has these community transition planning grants. It's always a problem, and it's always a problem when you get your funding to get away from the Pentagon. And so I think increasing that funding through the Economic Development Administration in the Commerce Department would be an important way for communities to get involved in doing this transition to figure out something else to do.
Thanks. So we're down to a couple of minutes. If this was a presidential debate, I would take all the additional questions, turn them into yes or no questions, have you raise your hand in a lightning round. But as we've seen, that's not actually that productive. So I think I'll wrap up. I will say, one thing that we touched on that Miriam talks about in her book and has mentioned is that this policy of global primacy, a kind of cover the globe military strategy that inflates the risk posed by China, that ignores the contribution of European allies to dealing with things like the challenge from Russia, that privileges military solutions over diplomacy, is part of what's driving this increase. But of course, the other piece is pork barrel politics and special interest politics, which is more what we addressed today. But Quincy's done quite a bit on the China question, on whether there's a diplomatic solution in Ukraine, on Pentagon spending more broadly. So you should look to our website, quincyinst.org. That's quincyinst.org for some of our work on that. I'm sure we'll have future forums addressing those questions as well. So I want to thank everybody for participating. We had a good crowd and great questions, which we could have gotten to them all. Before I wanted to go, there was just one other thing. There's a panel next week, Monday, the 25th, called The Short End of the Big Stick, Military Families Bear the Brunt of Our Foreign Policy. So you can find that on our website, or if you get on our mailing list, you'll get several reminders of that. So I want to thank Miriam and Emma Claire and Heidi for a great discussion. I know I learned a lot, and I hope you did. And clearly, based on the number of questions, other venues, other times will be available to keep discussing and moving this issue forward.